Welcome everyone to episode 7 of the Ethnically podcast. It's a podcast that's been thriving and been doing really well, and one that I've been really enjoying getting to know the variety of guests that I've had on the podcast. And today is no different. So I'm joined with Reese Wong, and just a bit of an introduction to Reese. Reese is a 21-year-old award-winning changemaker, community builder, and speaker, aiming to lead and catalyze social impact. He is currently building Micro Meetup. At the age of 16, he founded Hong Kong's largest youth-led NGO, where they empower changemakers through project-based learning. Since 2019, ISSIA has involved 300 plus volunteers from 80 plus schools, launching 30 plus projects, and was featured on the NASDAQ. As an international speaker, he's spoken to 4,000 plus attendees at 70 plus engagements, including global conferences and schools. He's got diverse public and private sector experience, including the US State Department, UK Civil Service, Linklaters, and McKinsey. And he's also a social impact champion. So, Reese, it's amazing to have you on the podcast. And I know you very well, as we're both on the RSA Youth Board. So, it's great to have a familiar face on the podcast. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, pretty good.
Amazing to have you on as today's guest. And as my first question, I know I've given you a bit of an introduction and a bit of a background, but do you want to sort of do a little bit more on your background in terms of your story and where you are today? What's kind of got you to this point where you are as a change maker in the world?
Yeah, for sure. So I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I spent like 19 years of my life there before moving here to the UK, emigrating actually with my family and starting university. But I think really my story started that when I was age 16, did an internship at a mental health charity. And up until that point, I was very academically focused, writing essays, really just diving deep into sort of just theory. But doing the internship, I realized how much you can actually learn by simply doing. This idea of experiential learning. And from that, I launched my first NGO, Is It HK, which I ran for 3 to 4 years. But what I realized from that is that there's so much power in building communities, scaling communities, but also in this sort of social impact space. And yeah, since having moved to the UK, I'm still very involved in that ecosystem, but now also like the entrepreneurship and startup ecosystem as well, figuring out what does impact look like with technology, or what does impact look like in a sort of building out an innovation ecosystem, for example. So yeah, I've been involved with quite a few exciting projects since moving to the UK. Touch
No,
on
that's
that
that's
later as
amazing. I
well.
think it's really exciting to hear like how your entrepreneurial journey has been shaped through like moving from Hong Kong to the UK. Um, I guess one quick follow up question: how have you found? Because I know you're still quite young and still early on in your entrepreneurial journey, um, and trying to make as much social impact as possible. What would you say are the main differences between being an entrepreneur in Hong Kong versus being an entrepreneur in the UK, for example? Or are there any differences, or is it very similar?
That's a really good one. I'd say like there are quite a few differences in that it's a different way of life, perhaps, in
Like
the
much
sense
more.
the UK is much, much larger. Hong Kong is really tiny. You can like via this MTR system, we have the train like get from like point A to point B, like two different sides of the city in like 40 minutes. So it's really compact. And I think also I was at a stage in my life where, right, like I was like age 0 to 19, where you don't necessarily have the best sense of the ecosystem as well. So I think what's great about the UK is that it's so much larger, but also being in London, for example, there's such a even greater density of opportunities and resources available. So I think in that sense, it's like a bigger ecosystem, which I've been super keen and eager to tap into. And I think there's a cultural component as well. It's like maybe the UK still has some ways to go, but I think it's generally quite encouraging, or more encouraging than like Hong Kong and like Asia in general, of say like exploring entrepreneurship early on in your career as a career path, or as a way to build skill. So I think there's these two things. One is just like the ecosystem, and then number two, it's this like culture as well of like
Mm. No,
entrepreneurship.
definitely. It's interesting highlighting those differences. I guess with the UK having a bigger ecosystem, I guess this kind of means there's more because most people's entrepreneurial ideas come from solving problems. I'm guessing there's more problems in the UK than there is in Hong Kong.
Mm,
Um, I think one thing I wanted to touch on was in terms of like you kind of touched on, you did some internships, you had a bit of experience when you were younger that kind of kick-started wanting
mm,
to be in social impact and entrepreneurship. Could you elaborate on like some of those experiences and kind of what was the thing that made you say, okay, this is what I want to do. I know I want to be a social change maker. I know I want to make a positive impact. Was there a key experience that kind of triggered that for you?
for sure. So, after I did my internship, I started this organization, right? Initially, the concept was really just like a network. In Hong Kong, especially, there wasn't even really a network of people who wanted to work on these problems necessarily, especially a young person focused network. So that was literally the initial concept of the organization. But then the issue with that obviously was that it lacked an anchor point. It lacked like a product or a service. So I introduced like a magazine. It was literally very simple, an inter-school magazine, but that was our excuse to reach out to schools, to build that network and then like get people working with us on all sorts of different projects where we eventually did like a lot of multimedia things, a podcast, magazines, like a whole documentary actually as well, all the way to our events and other programs. But what is the most memorable experience is like, I think 2 years in, so this is like 2021. Um, I basically cold called one of these educational conferences in Hong Kong. So I literally, phoned them up and was like, "Hey, I saw your program. Uh, would there be like any opportunities to speak here?" And they're like, actually, yes, we do. We actually don't have any sort of topic or agenda around like young people, but also around uh, this specific topic of like, what does DEI mean for international schools, for example, in particular. And I was like, okay, sure. This is something actually we'd love to build on. And as a result, myself and my team, we spent like a few months preparing basically this like 40-minute presentation where it was a mixture of me talking, but also like a survey we did. So showing survey results on like people's views. We did a whole docu-series. So we screened a part of a docu-series where we're highlighting people in the LGBTQ plus community and their experiences within these schools and how they sort of had to climb for so many sort of barriers and struggles, even within an international school. And so we did that. But what was most memorable to me was like, you'd think, and a lot of people say this, like, what is the impact of a talk? Or what is the impact of like advocacy or these like more hard to quantify things? But what was so amazing was that right after that talk, and again, this is an audience of like principals, educators, educational psychologists, like all of that. A lot of them actually came up to me and were like, "Hey, we'd love to follow up, actually get something done about this. Like, actually wanted to take action." And afterwards, I actually heard back that a lot of them like set up like student boards focused on like platforming this issue in their schools and so on and so forth. But what I think this experience taught me is like there actually is a tangible impact to like advocacy, to actually like giving a talk, because that is like a sort of cause and effect, right? You can see that when you say something, people actually have a change of mind where they actually want to do something. So I think that was really powerful for me. In that even though a lot of the things I do might be hard to quantify at times, it's like, how do you measure the impact of a talk or like, a program? But these are the moments where you're like, wow,
I
this
get
was
I
like
guess as
so
well
worth
for
it.
you, it must have been a moment where you realized this is I can now offer my value to other people. And I guess when you spoke for the first time at a public event, obviously you might have had those nerves or things going through your head before you're speaking. And then to have that feedback afterwards and people coming up to you and saying, look, we really love your ideas, we love what you're saying, that gives you, I guess, a confidence boost and kind of motivates you to want to continue doing that. So that's really amazing to hear, I think. And I guess it's a good segue into actually talking about your public speaking experiences. And now you've spoken at loads of conferences and events. As a young public speaker, I've always actually wanted to ask, um, how do you prepare for these big events, these big talks, and when you're speaking on stage, and um, how you know what you're going to say, how you're going to be confident, how you're going to come across best to your audience? What are some tips that you could give to, particularly, I think, young listeners from an ethnic minority background who want to get into public speaking? I think that would be a really interesting area for you to cover.
Yeah, for sure. I think the sort of answer is always like, it depends. It's like, it really depends on like who your audience is and what that engagement is all about. But I think in terms of how I prepare, it's like I generally speak on like some key topics, right? For example, like youth entrepreneurship or social impact or like even like branding, for example, or personal branding, like general personal development. So it's knowing like what's your value proposition. So at the end of the day, it's like, what are something you're reasonably knowledgeable about or something that you want to share based on your lived experience, right? And it's like building those like key content pillars in a sense. It's like, what do you want to be known for? What do you want to speak about? What are the sort of stories, experiences, data, things that you can do to build that out? And I think from there, now you have like a few good clusters, right? Like you have a cluster of content, stories, data, things for entrepreneurship. You have a very good cluster like stories, things, data for personal branding. I think that's how I've approached it is like I have like decks basically that I build out that would be for this topic. And every time I would like reformat or repurpose it depending on who I was speaking to. So I think when you're speaking to like an educator audience, I think that's quite different to when you're speaking to say, a group of high school students, which I do a lot. So it's like tailoring that content, but still having like a base foundation. Like what are the key things that you will always talk about no matter what engagement that is, right? Like what's your personal story, that sort of thing. But then also it's like there are all these other formats, right? Like panels and all of these. You can't really even prepare for that. It's really like, again, figuring out what are the core messages or the themes, areas you want to talk about, and then sort of getting started. That's like how I prepare. But what's maybe even more interesting is around like, how do you even get started here? And like, that's sort of the classic chicken and egg problem, right? It's like, you know, it's all well and good to like, once you already have a few under your belt, just like do more. But how do you even get that like whole process started? So my advice for that is like, it's around like personal branding as well. It's like sharing more about your work. Like a lot of the case studies outside of myself that I've seen are like people just posting a LinkedIn or sharing like what cool things that they've been involved with. And that generates excitement. And people are excited. They want you to share. And I think that's the really like first principles approach. You generate excitement. People want you to speak to their audience to share more, right?
Mm.
Of what made them excited. So I think that's one. But number two is like find any opportunity under the sun to speak. So it could be just like if you're part of a committee at university, organizing your own event, you're the one moderating that event, for example. Like I do a lot of panel events where I'm the one moderating, for example. Hosting your own workshop. Do you know like your own school, your high school or sixth form, or like other schools? Can you literally just host your own workshop on an area you're passionate about? Do you know other people who are like organizing events that you might be a great fit for? So it's really finding any way possible to just get that initial uh, like ignition started, and then it becomes much easier from there. But I think it's really a good skill to build. Like you'll need public speaking and communication skills no matter where you go. It's just finding the right avenues to really
No, definitely.
showcase
I
your
think
skills.
that's really interesting. Note like all of those sort of skills and abilities that not only you started with, but you kind of have developed through your own public speaking engagements. I think it's really useful the tips around having decks and repurposing it though, because I think sometimes and probably
Mm.
often you're going to actually use the same talk, but just going to repurpose it for different audiences.
Yeah.
I think lots of people think that they have to come up with a new talk every time they speak to do a public engagement talk, for example. So I
Mm.
think that's a really good piece of advice that you've given. I guess as well, a lot of your speaking engagements and things that you've done have come from your entrepreneurial journey, which I'll talk more about now.
Sure.
You obviously founded, is it Isia, right? Not wrong, so we can correct that.
Yeah.
So you founded Isia when you were 16. My first question is why Isia and why at 16? Why was it the right time to set it up, and what provoked you to set it up?
Yeah. I think it's again back to this internship, but also it's like seeing a very obvious problem to solve. I think this is one of those things where, especially in like Hong Kong, there just wasn't something like this. So it was like a clear gap. So myself and the other interns are like, this might be interesting to sort of get started. And that was really sort of the ignition point. But then afterwards, the reason that I stayed on and scaled it was like, I saw that there was quite a lot of interest. There was a lot of engagement. We validated that this is a problem that people face and something that people actually want. And as a result, it was very sort of easy to scale um, and build further interest and demand. And what's interesting though is why I think this like age 16 or like your middle to late high schoolers are so important as well. It's like as of the earlier you are in your life, like you have generally slightly less responsibility in a sense, like, well, definitely, generally speaking, uh, you are able to use your student status in a way that is, hey, people are more willing to help out. But also, secondly, like you're at a stage where you're more, you have more freedom to explore. And I think people should be using that time to really explore. And I think what I did was, yeah, exploring by building, learning by building. And I think that was something that's super, super enjoyable. But what's massively interesting too is like the actions I take at age 16 and like that's so long ago, 5 years ago, still have ripple effects of the things I do now, right? The opportunities I've had can be like generally traced back to this one decision I made at age 16. And that's pretty wild to think about. But like once I got a notebook and I started like mapping out everything that I've done and I was tracing like what one thing led to like other things. Like, could I like trace all the sort of genealogy of all the experiences I've had? And there were some dead ends, right? Like 1 or 2 were like, they just like
Mm.
happened randomly, I applied. But maybe like 80%, I could trace to like 2 or 3 things that I did at like 16 or 17. Like that led to me talking to this person, which led me to here, which led me to this, which led me to that. So I think it's like one of these things where starting a project or doing something like this can actually be like life altering or life changing in a lot of ways. And it has for me. So in a lot of my talks, what I encourage is like for young people, firstly, to find their North Star, like find what they're passionate about, what they want to solve, but really like build something. It could be a nonprofit, it could be a startup, it could be just a side project where they really able to elevate their ambitions, but also have like autonomy over their learning journey. I think this is what's the most important part. Is like
Mm.
they feel that they have ownership and they see that they have an idea that's completely conceptual, that they can turn it into an actual thing. I think that process really does something in terms of altering what you think is like success and altering what you consider like as ambitious. Because the minute you are seeing that you're able to actually get something done, I think that sets you up for possibly a lifetime of like entrepreneurship or like this idea of change making. So it's like, how do you get more young people to expand this, I what I call imaginatory horizon? That their like imagination is like broader instead of smaller and more narrow as they grow older. So that's something I'm super
That's
proud of.
yeah, that is really. I think it's a very important topic actually because that's and something I'm equally as passionate about. Um, I think young
Mhm.
change makers, and so you touched on it when you're 16. I think even between, I would say from ages 16 to 25, you still have so much time to think about obviously your career and what you want to do moving forward. But it's definitely the right time to experiment and kind of like you touched on, kind of be creative and come up with those solutions, those ideas, those projects that you want to do that take up your time, but you're also equally as passionate about. I think we're quite fixated on careers and kind of what careers we want to do and the things, university, work that kind of get in the way. But if you can be creative and you've got the time and energy to create something yourself, I think definitely that's powerful advice. I think every young person should be looking to be doing that, especially in this generation. We're kind of in the creator economy at the moment where content is king, and
Yeah.
it's very important that I think young people are expressing themselves on a creative level and on an entrepreneurial level, like you mentioned. Speaking of your next entrepreneurial venture, and I know we've spoken briefly about this offline, but you founded Micro Meetup, and I guess that's something that you're really passionate about setting up in London, and you want to expand it further. Um, Again, kind of similar question to the previous one, but more focused on Micro Meetup. What was the inspiration behind setting up that venture, and how do you see that prospering? What are the things that you've learned, the challenges you've had along the way, and yeah, what sort of insight could you give along that journey, if that makes sense?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because the problem that I'm trying to solve with that is super tough. And it's been something that people have been trying to solve for like decades. But really at the root cause of it is this idea of like human connectivity. But my own story with it is like arriving to London, one thing I noticed is especially that there is a lack of a campus community, especially in any big city. It's very transitory. People commute like myself. Is it really the same community you might get in somewhere that's more like like a campus or like more like rural, for example? Um, the second thing I noticed is when I ask people who graduate, how many percent of people do you know in your own program? They tell me like, maybe like 20%. And then I ask like, how many percent of these people you'd be willing to reach out to? And that number like drops to single digits. And what you realize is like people are going to university, people are not getting and tapping into one of the biggest value add, which is the university network and that alumni network. And that's such a big lost potential. But then you really dig in deeper and you realize not just university, many, many communities, right? Like we're both in so many communities, realize that people join, but they might not have an excuse or a trigger to connect. Like you can, this is the thing, you can like put like 30 people in a room or 15 people in a room, but that doesn't mean that they'll naturally like build meaningful relationships and connections. So that was the problem sort of that we're trying to solve. The micro meetup sort of solution to that was initially was like basically this idea of a micro event, a small, spontaneous, surprising gathering of 3 to 5 people, where it's really just, again, a way to rapidly meet new people, but then it gives you an excuse to reach out, right? Like you meet them casually for like a coffee chat or like, museum, trying out a new restaurant. But then later on, you get an excuse to reach out. So we launched that on the campus last year with like a no code prototype, got a bit of traction, but we realized the biggest problem of this was that getting people to convert from attendee to host was super difficult. So getting people to be like, hey, I'm going to host this event was super tough. So that's one learning. So now we're trying to work towards like more automations, like this idea of AI enablement. So it's like instead of you having to self-organize this whole thing, which is a big burden, right? Not everyone wants to be an event host. It's where you input your preferences. And the output is like you get a calendar invite, for example, that tells you who, what, when, where to meet. So that's what we're building. But I'm also working on projects outside of this, solving this problem of like community building, meaningful connections. So I've been organizing like created dinners as well, where I invite people in my network for like, and it's like a group of 10 to 12. And instead of your normal dinner event where you're stuck at a table, you have no idea who's sitting next to you, and you kind of move around and you end up like talking to these two people next to you for like the whole event, we facilitate. So we have like a set question everyone answers. And then there's like moment to move around. There's this idea of like, how can you be intentional about event design? How can you make sure that from a user experience standpoint, every attendee of your event actually gets something out of it? I think it's like, I've been to so many networking events where no idea who's going, and then I end up like feeling like, that wasn't a greatest use of like 2 hours of my time. So let's figure out how do you improve event experiences overall. So I'm working on quite a few things, but it's all like, how can you improve like human connectivity? How do you improve communities so that people can actually build meaningful relationships? This area is super tough, but it's been super interesting figuring out like what solution would work for this specific
There's
problem
definitely,
space.
I guess with this problem as well, not just one not there's not just one problem within the problem, if that makes sense. I guess you mentioned like, there's community and getting people in the
Yeah.
room, then there's the event design, but there's also the psychology of people when they come to the event, people not to host events, people more wanting
Mm,
to attend. So it's like it is a very complicated problem, but um,
yeah.
well, yeah, big up to you for trying to find a solution to that because I think it is particularly I think COVID had a massive impact on people's activity. I know
Mm,
we're now more used to virtually connecting to people, whether that's Zoom, online, phone call. But I think that face to face meetup,
yeah.
has kind of it's still so valuable and it's kind of lost its touch. And I think it's really important to make sure
Mm.
we're still having those events. And I think a lot of people missed that over COVID. Did you think COVID was a big drive of wanting to change that, or was that kind of something you envisaged solving regardless of COVID?
But like it's been a problem like since forever, I think. Like ever since there was like these ways to digitally connect, you realize that there's all these, again, like hypothetically at a university, you technically have everyone's LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever, but it's like, that
Yeah.
does that make people connected? Like just because you have their profile, like would you reach out? That's the question. So I think that has always already been a problem. But I think what COVID has done is like accelerate the problems. Like people are at home, they're not having like social interactions, they aren't regular spaces for gathering. There's no consistency in community building, then that just makes it much worse. So I think there's also just like a big gap in people's ability to like meaningfully connect and especially meet up in person. So I think that's like an accelerant of the problem. But I think what's more root cause is like, again, there are so many communities out there. Again, there's like two layers of the problem, as you said. It's not that there aren't communities. It's just that even when there are communities, what does it take for a community to actually achieve those like strong like network effects, but also like that individual members can get something out of it, right? And generally, it's like for any community that you're in, there's going to be like free riders. There's going to be people who like disengage, but it's also like how can you at least improve that experience? How can you create a baseline user experience for a community that is like really really good? So I think that is like
Mm.
outside of COVID even. A lot of people have an intention to build meaningful relationships. That's why they join communities. But are they actually able to achieve that goal? What's stopping them? Right. Anyways, so that's a tough problem to crack
Mm.
though,
Yeah,
regardless
no,
of
that's
COVID.
true. I think, yeah, definitely COVID is sort of made the problem more acute, but it was already a problem before
Yeah.
the pandemic. So I think yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And I think that's one thing that's kind of the most powerful thing about today's society is that we all feel in any way that we feel we are part of a community of some kind. So it's always going to be both a great thing, but also how do you maximize that to the best of its potential, the communities that you're in, whether that's online, but more prominently to what you're doing in person and creating those spaces where people can sort of connect on a deeper level. Um, that's really powerful. In terms of micro meetup and like I think you're a few years into your entrepreneurship journey, where do you see, and this is a massive question, where do you see the next 5 to 10 years of entrepreneurship for not just yourself, but in the world? What do you see as the biggest factors that are gonna come to play? How do you, it's a lot of questions in one, but how do you feel that's gonna impact you as an entrepreneur and how you continue building micro meetup?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. I think what's interesting too is like this is something I'm passionate about. Is like the big macro question too around like ecosystem building, right? Like, what are the incentives in place that more people will be like pursuing entrepreneurship, taking those risks and everything. But what does even entrepreneurship look like, right? Around like, is it literally just building a venture backed startup? Is it all these other forms and ways? Like before I'll break down the sort of framework in my mind, what I see or what I view entrepreneurship is a mindset. So one of my favorite books is this book by Reid Hoffman called The Startup of You. And basically what it is, it's like applying lean startup principles to career design, basically, and to life design. Like that concept that, again, perhaps not everyone is fit to be a so-called venture-backed entrepreneur. That's a very niche category serving a very specific audience. But everyone can take entrepreneurial lessons, mindsets, frameworks, and apply it to like different domains, whatever they're like either working in corporate or like, they're trying to design their life. That's my sort of general take. It's like entrepreneurship, and it already is the case, but it'll be more of the case where it's much more rather than very mythologized notion of like raising lots of money and building in Silicon Valley. It's a much more democratized model of what it means to be an entrepreneur. That's one big big bucket. But I think from that, I think the sort of key trends is like there is going to be much more of a level playing field for non-technical founders. So like myself, where sure, I can build with no code, but it will be even easier and streamlined to build really scalable software solutions at speed. And that's going to be a game changer for non-technical founders where, yes, maybe eventually they'll still need to hire like technical folk. At least that starting point, you're able to deliver an MVP much faster. And so that initial coding skills may not be as necessary. That's really, really powerful. What that means as well is for a lot of people in the nonprofit or social impact space, you'll get even easier access to building like scalable technology tools for their like projects and ventures. And that's again a game changer. Another sort of key trend perhaps is then like companies will also be like smaller. This is another take where it's this concept that because you're able to outsource or automate or have like GPTs that do such a big range of tasks, you can have much smaller companies doing a much bigger, significant work than would you would expect. So like 5-person startups, 10-person startups doing the work of like historically 200 or 300 people. So that could be again a big game changer. And I think number three is my take on like this concept of like AI agents as well. So this idea that rather than just what we see with like ChatGPT, there's possibly a big scope that you have AI models that will do the actual work. And we already see this initially, but imagine you set them an outcome, it will help you achieve that outcome. You wouldn't have to be a co-pilot. So again, that has massive effects for like productivity and the future of work as well. But I think what that means for me, moving down this sort of funnel is like, I'm pretty sort of flexible in terms of being adaptable to these different tools, like all these different angles, these different solutions. So I'm like also figuring out like how do I future proof myself? How do I like set myself up for this future work? So it's like building skills that are quite generalist, that are like across different domains and areas. Um, Building platform, like that's super important, but also like putting yourself out there, right? Because I think personal branding is something that no matter all these big macro changes will still be a key part of like getting more opportunity. But what I think this means for my ventures as well is probably not being like super committed to just like one solution. Like I have a problem I want to solve. And there are other problems too, but figuring out like maybe there's a better way to solve this problem than what I've designed. Maybe there's some other pathway. So I think it's also over the next 5 to 10 years, like figuring out all the other ways I can make an impact or all the other ways I could solve this big, hairy problem.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, those are definitely trends that I had in my head that would definitely be impacting. I mean, you touched on AI, not just as an agent, but sort of leading the change, which I think is a very big one. And we're already seeing that in today's society, but I think yeah, over the next few years, we're gonna really see that take the forefront. Um, and yeah, I think in terms of the impact on the future of work and how I think the first point you touched on around entrepreneurialism not just being a VC backed project or business, but being something that you incorporate in everyday life. I think we're going to see that a lot more. I guess we see that a lot in terms of another aspect that you touched on, which was personal branding, and something that I actually wanted to go into just now, because that's something that I think a lot of not just young people, but across a range of industries and across a range of demographics, you're seeing loads of people building up their personal brand, whether that's on LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, whatever platform that is, or whether that's just through doing speaking engagements and having an online presence. Um, One thing I wanted to ask in terms of as as a young person now, and as someone that's going to continue building their personal brand, what tips and advice? I know you kind of touched on it earlier, like getting yourself out there, starting your own projects, posting on LinkedIn. But what other, not just things that young people can do, but what other attributes do you need to develop in order to build that personal brand and have that accelerated online, if that makes sense? Like, what are the key things that if I'm a young person today, I want to start building my personal brand? What are the things, the skills I need to work on myself in order to do that?
Let's say hypothetically, an AI agent, I have an AI agent, and our AI agents are like interacting and like getting work done or having like you're able to get stuff done. The question is, why would someone's AI agent even want to work or communicate or engage with your AI agent? So it's the same way that again, there still needs to be a fundamental value proposition, and that is like who you are. What value do you provide outside of the work you do? So one other framework that is super important is this idea of like this matrix where this is the one end x-axis is like how good you are at what you do. And the axis, y-axis is how good you are at communicating what you do. And generally, if you're again super successful in like doing stuff and you cannot communicate, you'll still be pretty good. You'll still do very well. If you're like completely just like purely yapping and you have like no ability to do work, yeah, you generally probably also do fine. Again, not the best way to live life. But really at the top end of both angles is if you're very good at what you do, but also very good at communicating what you do. I think that's really what personal branding is about. It's about reputation management. Can you communicate how good you are at what you do in a way that is reflective, accurate, but also can really get you more opportunity? And I think that's the sort of angle where personal branding creates compounding effects, where if you just do something and no one knows about it, that's finite. Yeah, there's no like extra things that will come from it. But if you're able to have a platform where you share the things you do, that one thing may lead to another thing, may lead to another thing, and that's like an exponential growth. I think that's why people should do it. But how they should do it is, I think, again, clarify their like personal values or core values. What is it you want to be known for? In the same way as like building your reputation in person, right? Like I do good work. Therefore, my core value is like, I want to be seen as like high work ethic, for example, or like these sort of things. And it's figuring out how do you transpose and replicate that on an online setting. So like how can the content you create showcase these core values that you want to communicate and therefore build your reputation? So I think it's like also being savvy with your content strategy. So it could be a podcast like this, or it could be writing. It could be joining different initiatives or helping others with content. It could be, again, my favorite, running a project itself, like an organization, which gives you a great platform benefit to like reach out to people, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's many ways to go about it, but I think at the core of it, though, I also see a trend where it's like, you know, people jump straight into personal branding
Mm.
without having done the work. And that is potentially risky and dangerous, right? It's like, yes, everyone can do personal branding because, everyone has core values they want to share, and that's a good thing. But you also want to be doing the work in terms of like having that experience, running that project, actually going out there and solving problems. So I think the best personal brands, also brands that have substance behind it and have like projects, because that's what gives it legitimacy. That's what gives it weight. And that's why people want to reach out. So I think it's about, it's like back to that matrix. If you're just really good at communicating what you do, but you're not doing that much at all, that's not a very good brand. The real best brands are ones that really have this convergence
Yeah,
time.
no, 100%. I think that's a good sort of matrix and example to kind of go off, because sometimes a lot of people do a lot of doing, but they don't really talk about it. And a lot of people do a lot of talking and they don't really do anything. So it's
Yeah,
kind of like meeting the action with the words, and me making your actions mean actions. There's a saying that actions speak louder than words, but sometimes you gotta have a balance with the
really.
personal branding.
Exactly.
Um, that's
Mhm.
really, really interesting. I think the values piece as well around what do you want your brand to, it's kind of like if you were to set up your own business, you have to have your own values, your own vision. It's kind of like,
Exactly.
what's that for yourself, really? If you were your own enterprise,
Yeah.
what would your mission be? What would your core values be? What would your purpose, mission, ethos, culture? So, and I guess it's just about
Exactly.
communicating that on an online digital platform or whatever platform you want to. Um,
Yeah.
n-
Exactly. And that's like, again, the same way companies do it, right? Like they have to figure out what are those core values, mission, vision, like all of that before they build like a brand identity surrounding that, right? Like what's the look and feel? What's the color scheme? What's the typography? Like all comes from that first principles of like, how does this
yeah,
company want to be perceived? And so in many ways, exactly like the same principles people use for marketing in like company context or brand design context is really now you're thinking yourself. You are the company. You are this like enterprise of sorts. How would you want to be perceived? So I think yeah, powerful
yeah,
thing.
no, it is. I think it's a really interesting piece actually that I think I'm really glad we kind of discussed on the podcast, because I know
Mhm.
that's something we can kind of touch on it as young fellows of the RSA, and being part of the youth board is something that we're really passionate about amplifying for not just young people but the young fellows that we work with. Um, I wanted to touch on one sort of topic that you alluded to briefly, and it's obviously a big topic of the Ethnically podcast, and that's sort of diversity and inclusion and
Mhm.
equity. Um,
Mhm.
tackling anti-racism and those metrics. And I
Yeah.
know D&I is a big value of yourself. What, just as we move towards transitioning towards the end of the episode, in terms of D&I and ethnically and all of those things, how does that show up in your work? What does D&I mean to you, and how do you, yeah, as part of your personal brand, how do you make sure you're providing inclusive opportunities and diversity of thought and talent and people in your work? And yeah, how does that show up?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think what's always super interesting is like, especially in the UK now, like all the spaces I'm in, I'm like almost always like one of two
Mm,
like Asian people there, or like often like the only East Asian person there, interestingly. And that is quite interesting. And I think it's multiple reasons for it. I think it's like these institutions or spaces don't seem welcoming enough, or there aren't any on ramps that or examples where people are like, hey, this person's done this before. Like, I could do it too. So I think there's that aspect. But then the other aspect is also like back to like ambition or imaginatory horizon. Like I think when you have to balance like, this conventional like financial security, financial stability, that changes values, right? Or it changes what people prioritize. And especially for social impact in the sector and all these like voluntary things, you're never well compensated. So in a way, it is a privilege to be able to spend so much time doing this versus say like doing paid work and otherwise. I think that's also a thing to really think about and consider. Is like what are the unique aspects of your life that allow you to really be empowered as a change maker or as an entrepreneur. So those dynamics are quite important. But that's something I see a lot is again, the systems or institutions like it's not always obvious like how they're able to change that whole like wider system issue, right? Of like incentives and all of that. And it's a big sector wide issue. For how I see it in my own work too, it's like
mm.
firstly myself, it's like speaking a lot, going to all these engagements, really like showcasing what's possible. But then also secondly, it's like trying to break into spaces that haven't been broken to before. So quite like conventionally, like sitting on boards, like managing like certain organizations, like being someone who's willing to like push myself out of my comfort zone, even if I'm like the only person there who's like over a
Mm.
certain age or ethnicity, like being willing to be uncomfortable or like again out of my comfort zone. So I see that for myself. But I think for my own projects too, it's like, yeah, creating that condition where it's like people actually want to engage, actively think that it's like a possible thing to do. So it's like, again, this idea of on ramps. Are there things that would make it easier? Are there things that would lower the barriers to joining or the opportunity costs, right? I mean, I was obviously doing very good outreach too. Like, again, back to the personal branding platform thing. If you can broadcast to a wide audience as a result. And you're also making it welcoming, then like both ends, outbound, inbound, able to really increase our representation or like what are the viewpoints that are actually on your board. I think that's also super interesting one is diversity of viewpoints. That's something I think that's overlooked in this space. How do you not just go beyond like traditional, like biographical, like biological, like that sort of diversity to this like more ideological diversity? I think that's generally tough because a lot of these boards are like generally in social impact sector, nonprofit sector, or like these spaces are quite like left leaning. So I think one thing is like, how do you really platform like a whole bigger range of views? Obviously, like being mindful that they have to be reasonable. That's a tough one. So I don't think I've necessarily solved that. A lot of the spaces I'm in are very like they're already all aligned at a fundamental level. So I don't know. It's tough one.
Yeah, no, it is tough. It's a tough it's always a tough topic to really talk about, and I guess it's one of the reasons why I want to set up this podcast because I we
Mm,
the groups and the communities I'm in we're all focused on social impact, but I think it's kind of like the one that my main reason, and I've said this on other episodes, main reason why I think diversity and inclusion is so important is I think it's the source of every answer to every problem. If you've got a diversity of people
mm,
around a problem, they can solve it. And I think that's my biggest the thing I feel like I take away from every conversation that I have is that I'm always learning something different from every episode. and every guest that I have. And therefore, I feel like I'm more capable of solving the problems that I've not just my personal problems, but challenges that I want to see change in the world. So I think it is a difficult topic, but I think from what you said, if you can incorporate it and be passionate about it, and from your experiences, sometimes you're the only person in the room from a particular background, and it kind of makes you feel sometimes uncomfortable. But I think, like you mentioned, embracing it and really using it for good, I think is definitely one thing that I think a lot of people would want to take away, and definitely like moving forward. I think we're seeing that a lot more as well. Um, so yeah, that's really interesting. And I've already given you a heads up, and as which I haven't actually done to other guests. So you've actually got a pretty advantageous um, position here. But I did say that I've got a question that was already said to you from my previous guest of the Ethnically podcast, and I have got that question if you're ready to answer. So this question was from my last guest, Isabella, who she was a vice president of a social of she was vice president of a FTSE 100 company, and she was working in social impact. So someone that's, really has had a broad experience in the social impact world. You kind of did touch on it in the last answer, but particularly when it comes to charitable work, I think I would want to hear your perspective on having a deep knowledge of anti-racism and DNA, and also how do you
Yeah.
bring marginalized people along the journey with you when you're working on these social impact projects?
Yeah. I think really, if you think about social impact on a first principles basis, what is the most effective social impact design? Is one that is user centered, right? Or
Mm.
beneficiary centered in this case. And if you think about it, generally these marginalized groups, and especially if you're charity that focus on these groups, you are serving that beneficiary and they need the most support. How better to improve your design and delivery by actually going to these people and actually asking what they need and incorporating them into your decision making process. So I think that's why diversity at its core is so important, is especially for the charity sector. If you're so far removed from your beneficiaries that you're like coming up with like just like solutions on the fly or basing it on like academic research, then you're not perhaps delivering the best service you can to your end beneficiary. So I think that's the core of it. It's like from a decision making process, from a governance perspective process, from just like a actual service delivery process. Diversity is important because those are the people you're serving, and those are the people who are the core to the reason why your charity or NGO exists. That's one. Um, but I think secondly too, it's like anti-racism and this sort of philosophy too is like you don't know what you don't know until you know. So it's like, well, if you don't have some intervention of sorts, you have a knowledge gap. So it's like unknown unknowns. So you're not able to take any action on it or build any KPIs if you don't even know what that knowledge gap is. So until you're able to, with that philosophy, like remove your unconscious
Yeah.
biases that you don't even know are there, then you can't even like actually make progress or actually like resolve or drive like projects and move towards inclusivity, diversity. I think those two are like part and parcel of each other. But I think especially for the charity sector, if you're working with these groups, you really need to talk to them. You really need to really bring them into the design process.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it is a thing I think we're seeing. It's probably one of the biggest trends we're seeing in the charity sector right now, actually, working with marginalized groups.
Mm.
Not only just to hear what they have to say, but centering them at the core of the solution, getting their ideas transparently, incorporated in the design. So no, those are really powerful ideas, and I think a very, very interesting answer to quite a difficult question, actually. So you answered that amazingly.
Mm.
Um, and now it's your opportunity, Reese, to provide a new question for the next guest that I'll have on the podcast. I'm not sure who that is at this moment in time, but that's the spontaneity that I like about this segment, because you get to ask a question and you have no idea who I'm asking it to. So anything around the
Yeah.
topics that we've discussed today, and what I like to cover on the Ethnically podcast around diversity, inclusion, social impact, anti-racism, all of those themes that we've kind of entrepreneurialism, all these things that we've kind of discussed. What is one question you would like me to ask the next guest?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. It's on top of mind because I work at this like intersection of private sector and public sector and first sector, right? So I often get all these vantage points and like very different like worldview sometimes. But what is super interesting is recently I was working with this VC, this venture capitalist who is really passionate about trying to incorporate like startup like principles for like nonprofit and charity. So maybe my question to the next guest is like, what do you think the public sector and public sector and the third sector can learn from the private sector? Are there any sort of strategies and tools that you think could be beneficial to be applied? And how best to convince people in like these two sectors to adopt some of these like private sector practices? And then the other reverse angle of it is what can private sector stakeholders and folks learn from the charity and public sector that is, yeah, currently sort of missing and under tap? I think those would
Yeah,
be my two
interesting.
pronged
No,
questions.
that's a really fascinating question, and not a question that we've really had before. So I look forward to hearing what the answer to that question is, and I'm sure you will as well. But yeah, no, that's been brilliant, and it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you, Reese. I think I really, not just me, but I'm sure listeners that will be listening to this would have enjoyed hearing your story, particularly young listeners, knowing that you as a 21-year-old entrepreneur, you're already making this positive change. I'm sure that's going to inspire people listening to want to get started and start building their own personal brand, for example, or building that startup or that idea that they've always had. So, yeah, like I said, it's been an absolute honor to have you on as today's guests. And yeah, that's a wrap for today. And just, yeah, once again, thank you so much, Reese, for coming along.
All right,
Cheers.
appreciate it. This
Amazing.
is great.
Thanks.